Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to announce the speaker today, Dr. Rebecca Hale. So Dr. Hale works at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where she's a PI and senior scientist in ecology. Although I think it's fair to say that through the talk today, we'll see that you're at the interface of ecology, sociology, hydrology, and biogeochemistry, so a lot of different things. Dr. Hale received her PhD in 2013 from Arizona State University, and she's going to talk about watersheds and urban watersheds and how they influence urban streams across different scales.
Thanks. Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here today. So I'm going to talk about cities, and cities are really exciting ecosystems to work in because they're designed. Humans shape almost every single aspect of this, and much of that is intentional. So we change the surface of cities, we change the vegetation of cities, we change the hydrology of cities, we actively move nutrients and water. Oh, good point. Thanks. All around these ecosystems. And cities are also really heterogeneous ecosystems. So just some examples here, we have variation in the density of septic systems in Miami, Florida, variation in canopy cover across Baltimore, and variation in stormwater infrastructure, which I'll talk more about in Arizona. And this heterogeneity is caused by kind of how cities have kind of been developed and changed through time. So what we see today is really reflective of the past. So the types of infrastructure that we've built, this is pictures of combined sewers going in Pittsburgh, which we thought were a really great idea back then. And then we've learned some things. Or the way that we design infrastructure, or things like housing discrimination, which has shaped the delivery of services and infrastructure across many cities. So all of these things are interplaying to shape the way that cities look today. And a lot of the way that this is kind of changed through time reflects changing ideas about what kind of problems we're trying to solve in cities, what we're trying to do when we actually design things in cities, and the types of infrastructure technology that we have at hand, our understanding. So for an example, thinking about stormwater, when people were first designing cities, they were like, oh wow, there's all this water when we pave surfaces and the water doesn't have anywhere to go, it creates flooding problems. So a lot of the infrastructure that we developed was really about like just moving that water out of the system. And then through time, that has really expanded. So we've expanded to start thinking about, well, maybe we look at ways that we can make this infrastructure create also recreational opportunities. Maybe we actually want to make it look nice. Maybe we want to deal with the quality of the water, not just think about how much water is there. Until places like today, we're thinking not just about the quantity of the water, recreation, aesthetics, how we integrate that with other elements of urban design, water quality, thinking about ecosystems, and maybe even reusing that stormwater. And so depending on what you're trying to do, you're going to end up with really different structure, whether that's a pipe under the ground that's shunting water downstream, or this is a picture from Salt Lake City, a wetland that's designed to it's got a nice trail, it looks pretty, you're trying to create habitat as well as create some other ecosystem benefits. Now, I've done a lot of work in urban streams. I think urban streams are a really amazing kind of place for exploring a lot of these issues. For one, they provide really important opportunities for interactions between humans and nature that we don't often get in many urban environments. So there's opportunities for fishing, for boating, for picking up rocks and throwing in the stream. These are my kids. That's their favorite thing to do. And so it's really important for us to understand what's kind of shaping the heterogeneity of these ecosystems so that they can provide the services that we really want, so that I don't have to worry about my kids sticking their hands in this water, which is full of E. coli. Gross. So this is a really big problem. Urban streams are often disgusting. So we have sewage, this is an example of sewage, overflows that can come into these systems either by design or not. Stormwater that's coming into that system with all the stuff that's all over our surfaces of the streets, trash in all of these places. So there's lots of problem with these ecosystems that really prohibit us from using them in the ways that we might want to. And so what I'm going to talk about today, and kind of what motivates a lot of my research program, is thinking about how do urban watersheds shape urban streams. So we understand what shapes urban streams, then maybe we can do a better job. How do we use that information to understand how to do a better job and design better cities so we can go and play in our urban streams and not have to worry about them? So I'm going to talk about this at 3 different scales today, at the local scale, continental, and the global scale. And I'm going to address this question of how, as we move from local to global scales, what kind of gradients or kind of sources of variation shape variation in watershed function? So what are the important gradients that we're looking at? And how are those shaped by the underlying geography, the climate, patterns of human development, and interactions between all those things? So I'm going to start at the local scale, talking about urban design and how shifting relationships between urban streams and urban watersheds or our shifting relationships with urban streams shape watershed function through time. This is work I did in Phoenix, Arizona. This is just proof for anyone who's a grad student, even though it's been, I'm not going to count, or you heard the number, a really long time since I finished my dissertation. You can still talk about it forever. So this is where I did my dissertation in Phoenix, Arizona. It's a desert, it's hot, it's super dry. I went there to study urban streams. My advisor was like, do you know there's not water in them? Which was great because I went on these like bike rides everywhere. This is what I did to decompress and saw all this cool stuff when I was biking around. And I was like, yeah, there's no streams, but look, we've got these retention basins, these like weird channels that are everywhere, some washes, sometimes you'd see some pipes, and this is all how we managed water, how we moved water across the desert landscape. So instead of studying urban streams, I studied urban stormwater, which I still will die on this hill, think are urban streams. So Phoenix is really neat because the way that people have used these different types of infrastructure has changed through time. So this is showing the proportion of infrastructure that was built from the 1950s to the early 2000s. And this is showing the proportion of infrastructure that was built as pipes. So we saw a lot of pipes in the 60s and 70s, and then starting in 1970s, a huge increase in the use of these retention basins. So in Phoenix, there's not a lot of water, but when there's a lot of water, there's a lot of water. And so in the 1970s, there was a new regulation that if you were building a development more than an acre, you had to hold a 100-year event on that property and prevent that from going downstream. It's not actually that much water in Phoenix to be a 100-year event. So they could actually build these huge things, and a lot of times they were sports fields and stuff like that. But we saw these pop up everywhere after that. These engineered channels also started increasing in the 1970s, really peaking in the 80s and 90s. And then more recently, and especially since the 90s, an increase in these remnant washes. So these aren't infrastructure, but there was a new regulation that said, you know, you can't actually pave over these. These are probably doing something important, like collecting water and making it not go in your basement. So what was really neat about this system is that this is the desert. I don't want to say it's empty, but there's a lot of space. So in the 1950s, development really started expanding, and it moved northward. So this is the city of Scottsdale, which is in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And so darker colors here are older development, and it started moving outwards through time. And because of that, we get these nice spatial patterns in the types of infrastructure that people are using. So the density of retention basins really high in these areas that were developed in the 70s through the 90s. And then I just love this one. You got pipes over here, and then channels, and then washes. Bump, 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 which is awesome if you want to know how these things are influencing watershed function, especially because if you've ever been to Phoenix, you know it is sprawl, 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 sprawl. The housing density is exactly the same across everywhere, so you have this really nice system where you can just look at variation in stormwater infrastructure, and I was particularly interested in looking at what comes off of these in terms of how much water and how much nutrients. So I'm going to show you the one slide of results, front version of this. That's the sad part about telling your dissertation. You're like, here's the slide. So this is showing different storm events. We went and chased storms for a couple of years. Highly recommend it for grad school. It always rained on the weekends. So this is rainfall on the x-axis here, and runoff. These are both in depth. And so each of these points here is a storm. And so you can see really high runoff from watersheds drained by pipes. So this is about, the runoff ratio here is about 0.5. So about half of the rainfall is leaving as runoff. it's about halved if you put these engineered channels there. And it's down to about 0.1 once you put in those retention basins. So these are functioning as designed, but we have really massive changes in urban hydrology depending on how we've plumbed the system, which is not shocking, but really important because a lot of urban hydrology systems studies really focus on land cover and not so much on the plumbing. So really big differences here. And these translate to really big differences in nutrient export from these watersheds as well. We've looked really hard to find like biogeochemistry happening here. It's really just driven by hydrology. There was no evidence of fun things like denitrification or anything. So I want to put this back into our timeline and think about how the city is developing through time, how it's functioning through time, and how that's going to lead to changes in infrastructure. So at the beginning, there were impervious surfaces. And these are going to lead to increased surface runoff and also increased nutrient export. And as a result, there's going to be some kind of learning and feedback in the system. So people are realizing that we have this problem of excess water, starting to build things like centralized storm sewer systems, which are also going to be influenced by current best practices. Those are changing through time as well. That's going to increase connectivity even more. So we also compared watersheds that had no infrastructure at all, and the pipes really accelerate the export of water from these watersheds. So in response to that, it's like, well, maybe we keep the landscape, the water on the landscape instead of sending it downstream. Now, when this was happening, this was also a current best practice. This is a trend that was happening nationwide. So we start seeing a lot of detention and retention basins across the country in the 60s and 70s. And in Phoenix, this actually leads to just tremendous retention even below what the natural ecosystem is. So a desert ecosystem is already pretty flashy, and this reduces it even further. And then more recently, we see this shift to more what we might call sustainable or ecological design. And this isn't necessarily in response to what's happening in the local system, but is shaped by these local regulations that are saying, let's start thinking about protecting some of these ecosystems. And even though it wasn't influenced by the system, it will influence the hydrology of the system. So here we see that locally, urban design and the shifting relationships we have with these urban streams are really shaping urban watershed function in really big ways. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the continental scale and how we can think about continental gradients and how that might shape kind of what's going on locally. This is part of a NSF Macrosystems funded project called the Carbon and Urban River Biogeochemistry Project. Here are the PIs in this project down along the bottom. And our goal here was really to understand the patterns of dissolved organic matter and how those vary across cities and whether we could make predictions about that variation, both kind of within and also among cities. So we picked 5 cities across the US, Portland, Salt Lake, Atlanta, Miami, and Boston, that have really different conditions, both in terms of climate, geography, and also infrastructure development patterns. So why dissolved organic matter? I love dissolved organic matter because it can tell us a lot about watershed function. Dissolved organic matter has been described as watershed tea, and I love this description because it tells you what kind of stuff you have in the watershed, and it tells you a lot about where your water has come from. So if your water is going through different types of soils, it's going to have different characteristics of organic matter. Within cities, it can tell us a lot about where the organic matter coming from soils, from groundwater, what's happening within the stream itself. So you have in-stream primary production, microbial processes. Organic matter can photodegrade, which we can also see in the quality of it. And then when you have cities, you have all different kinds of new sources of organic matter. And so looking at this can tell us a lot about how we've modified the system and what the impacts are. So previous work on the effects of urbanization on dissolved organic matter have found some pretty consistent patterns. And all of these studies, I'm just showing examples from one, have plotted these changes against impervious cover. So pavement, roads, buildings. And there have been some pretty consistent patterns. One is this loss of humic dissolved organic matter. So that's organic matter that's going to be coming from soils. It's been humidified, it's kind of worked over in that soils. And as you pave over these systems, you're kind of cutting off that pathway. The soils are no longer hydrologically connected to the surface waters, and so you see declines. The other consistent pattern is increases in autochthonous dissolved organic matter, which is our fancy way of saying in-stream primary production. And the idea here is that you're lopping down all these trees, and so you're increasing light availability to the stream. And then you might also have some nutrients and stuff coming in here and fueling a lot of that primary production. Then the other consistent pattern is increases in microbial organic matter. And that's because we have all sorts of anthropogenic microbial sources of organic matter coming in, like poop, human, pets, all sorts of stuff. So big increases in microbial, increases in autochthonous, decreases in humic. But again, all of this is kind of across this gradient of impervious cover. And this figure shows a lot more than impervious cover. So we were really interested in this project, trying to understand what is it about urban watersheds that shapes dissolved organic matter. And so the 5-second version of our methods is that we went out to these 5 different cities and we collected so many water samples. We collected across 100 locations at each city 4 times so we could catch seasonal patterns. And then we tried to characterize those different watersheds in any way that we could. So we tried to get our hands on all kinds of data that we could use to characterize different parts of the system. So what kind of tree canopy cover was there? How much impervious surface was there? We tried to get information about infrastructure like stormwater infrastructure and sanitary infrastructure. Turns out no one wants to give you those data. So what I'm going to show you right now is based on nationally available data sets that we could get. So to show you what this looks like, I'm going to show you some data from Boston, and then we'll kind of scale up. So this is work that was largely done by Annika Quick, who was a postdoc on the project, and now she's faculty at Virginia Wesleyan University. So she went out and collected all these samples across the Boston area, and we see just a really big range of organic matter concentrations. So this is in DOC, from 1 milligram per liter up to over 20 milligrams per liter. This is just in one season. This is just in September. And what we found is that if we're just trying to predict kind of how much carbon is there, this was most strongly predicted by the amount of woody wetlands in the contributing watershed, which makes a lot of sense. In natural areas, we just see the same kind of thing. Wetlands are major sources of organic matter. And so in this urban setting, what we see is these more urban areas where wetlands have been filled in and paved over. Boston is built on wetlands. Those places have basically a loss of organic matter. And so in this situation, urbanization is actually kind of cutting off this wetland source of organic matter. We also saw that the quality of organic matter really shifts with development. So we see this kind of gradient from woody wetlands to more development. And across this, we see a range from where we have higher wetland cover, we have more humic organic matter, so that's that more soil-derived organic matter. And with lower wetland cover, we see more autochthonous organic matter, so more in-stream production. So we see this loss of wetlands is shaping the DOM quality. And then Boston also has combined sewer system. And so another thing that we found is that these combined sewer outfalls had a very unique DOM signature, where we found this tryptophan-like, this is a microbial signature for organic matter, was really only seen in these sites that have high density of CSOs and only during wet periods. So these same sites during the summer when we didn't have, where it was very dry, we didn't see any of that organic matter. So we see this really unique wastewater signature. So the question now is, are these patterns consistent among cities? Do we see the same kind of patterns in Miami, which is also a city built on a wetland? Do we see different patterns in Salt Lake, which is a city built in the desert? So cities vary across biophysical gradients and also social gradients. And a big part of this project is trying to figure out which of these matter, and can we make predictions about what's going to matter within each individual city. We also see lots of variation in gradients within cities. So some patterns are relatively consistent. So we see with impervious cover, declines in income, increases in the percent minority population, and then variation in other ones. So we see a decline in general in canopy cover with urbanization in all cities, but the strength and the slope of that relationship is much stronger for cities like Atlanta and Boston, which are built in forested areas. And as you might not be surprised, in Phoenix, Salt Lake City, it's not as strong. So we have different gradients within each of these cities. So we're trying to test a few things in this project. We're trying to ask this question about whether DOM and its controls are predictable across these macro scale gradients. So I'm going to kind of walk through the approach here. So the idea is that this macro scale, so across the continent, can we make predictions about what the quality and quantity of DOM is? So we might hypothesize that terrestrial dissolved organic matter would be higher in cities that have more trees. So that makes sense. We have more trees, you're going to have more sources of organic matter in those places. So we would expect that across our cities, the ones that have more trees have more terrestrial organic matter. At the local scale within each of these, we might also hypothesize that for some cities like Atlanta, the city among the forest, there might be a strong relationship between terrestrial organic matter and canopy cover because there are so many trees, it's probably the dominant source of organic matter in the system, and there's also a really strong gradient. But maybe in Salt Lake City, it's not so good. We don't have a lot of trees here, most of them have been planted. It's a native sagebrush ecosystem. And then the cool part, I think, the part I'm excited about is, can we make predictions about this based on that? So can we predict the slope or the strength of the relationship between DOM and canopy cover based on canopy cover? Can we say, oh, we expect if you have a lot of canopy, it's going to be an important predictor? So I'm going to kind of walk through some very preliminary hot off the press things because we just finished collecting data this summer. All right, so first question. Are there macro scale gradients of terrestrial, urban, dissolved organic matter? And I'm going to show you canopy cover first, because we just talked about this. So I'm going to show a bunch of these plots. I'll orient you to them. So this is showing our landscape predictor on the x-axis here. This is our DOM quality. Each point here is a sample, but these big points are the means of all of those samples. And the regression relationship here is just for those 5 points. So keep that in mind. N of 5, huge grain of salt, bucket of salt. Okay, but in general, all right, so if you ignore Miami, this looks great, right? Salt Lake City doesn't have any trees, the relationship's weaker, Boston has a lot, it's better. Cool, Miami has really high terrestrial organic matter and very few trees. So it's not as great as we might have thought. This is showing wetland cover across all these, and we see a much stronger relationship where we see Miami has the highest, this is the humidification index, which is a measure of terrestrial organic matter, has the highest terrestrial organic matter and also the highest wetland cover. Atlanta seems to be a little bit off the line here because it has a lot of trees, so it has this other source of organic matter. So together, what we're seeing here is that there are these macro scale gradients in terrestrial organic matter, but kind of depends a little bit on what the source is, whether the dominant source is forest or wetland. Right, so highest in systems that have more sources, but what those sources are regionally variable. The other question we had is, are there macro scale gradients of autochthonous? So this is in-stream production. And we thought that precipitation might be an important gradient here. So precipitation drives primary production in grasslands and forests. We can use this to understand primary production in lots of systems. But we actually have the opposite hypothesis here, where if it's wetter, you expect to have less primary production in your stream because you're going to have more shading of that system, and you're also going to have higher connectivity between the terrestrial system and your stream. And we do see a pretty strong relation, or a fine relation, we'll call it a fine relationship, where you have more in-stream production in drier places and less in wetter places. There's a slightly stronger relationship if we look at the drainage density. So this is basically just the density of streams across your landscape. And so we see again that if you're more connected to that terrestrial landscape, you have less in-stream production than in systems that are less connected from that terrestrial landscape. So here we're seeing autochthonous DOM, in-stream production, highest in systems that have low connectivity to that terrestrial landscape because of hydrological connection. And then this was really interesting too. We have gradients of riparian canopy that drive, we have different measures. This is the slope ratio, E2 to E3. These are both absorbance metrics that tell us a little bit about how photodegraded our organic matter is. And look, so we have high values here indicating more photodegraded, lower values here indicating higher molecular weight, so just bigger organic matter compounds. And we see really strong relationships for both of these with riparian cover. So that's telling us that when you have a lot of riparian canopy, it's shading, it's protecting, and so you don't have as much photodegradation. I didn't expect to see anything this strong, so who knows? All right, so to sum up here in terms of macro scale gradients, it seems like there are some macro scale gradients in dissolved organic matter. It depends a little bit about what kind of sources are there, whether those are wetlands or trees. We see some climate-driven kind of gradients here as well, and also gradients in photodegradation. What I thought was really interesting is that we looked for relationships for a variety of anthropogenic or like landscape, like built environment factors, and we didn't find any. It really was climate, the natural environment that was driving these macro scale gradients. So what's going on locally? And do we see any cross-scale interactions? So I'll walk through some results for this. So we'd found that wetland cover was really important in Boston. It was the most important thing. It doesn't seem to matter anywhere else. And shockingly, it doesn't seem to matter in Miami either. Even more interestingly, the relationship between terrestrial organic matter and wetland cover doesn't seem to be predicted by wetland cover at all. So here we have this really interesting kind of situation where you have this macro scale gradient of wetland cover that seems to be driving the amount of organic matter in these systems, but it doesn't seem to be controlling what's going on locally. It's kind of a big X on our hypotheses. We get a little bit more information when we think about tree canopy. So this is looking at canopy cover within each of our cities. And terrestrial organic matter is related to canopy cover pretty much in all of these except Miami. If someone wants to, I'll just plant this now, ask a question about why Miami's weird. We can talk about it afterwards. And there's, if you squint, a reasonable-ish positive relationship between the percent canopy cover and how predictive canopy cover is of terrestrial organic matter in each individual city. But here we have Portland doesn't behave at all. So what's going on here? I'm expecting that Portland probably has other sources of organic matter that are not trees that are driving those gradients. And Salt Lake City doesn't have high canopy cover, but it doesn't have a lot of other sources of organic matter either. So what I'm expecting here is that trees are actually the main source of organic matter. And so they are really predictive, even though there's not as many of them. When we look at in-stream production, across all the literature, it's very highly correlated to impervious cover because impervious cover is negatively correlated with canopy cover. And so we see more light coming into systems that have impervious cover, more nutrients, all those things. So we see positive relationships. Again, Miami's weird. With this across the system, and then hold on to your hats. Oh, that's so cool. All right, canopy cover here on the x-axis, and here is that the correlation coefficient between imperviousness and in-stream production. So really strong relationship in Boston, which has the highest canopy cover. Not at all in Miami, weaker in Salt Lake. So what's going on here? Why would we have this much stronger prediction power of imperviousness in place with trees? So what I think is going on here is that if you have a forest, then your in-stream production is low. You've got the shaded system, you don't have very much primary production happening in the systems. And so as you clear the forest to put impervious surface down, you're gonna see increases. If you're in Salt Lake City, some places are high, some places are low. There's already a lot of kind of high in-stream production already because you're in a desert. And so you put impervious surface down, and it's not kind of fundamentally changing the system in the way that it is in these forested areas. So that's really exciting. So we have these macro scale gradients. Locally, we see that urbanization effects are not consistent among cities. And there are some cool cross-scale interactions that explain some of this variation, but there's a lot more to be explained. But I think what's really kind of an important takeaway from this initially is that these kind of classic models of urbanization, which are that you cut down trees, you put down impervious surface, you increase primary production, they really don't work in systems that are not already forested. They don't translate very well to Miami, and they don't translate well to Salt Lake City. So you want to know what's going on in Salt Lake City? Yeah. So in Salt Lake City, this was the city that I like because before I was at CERC, I was in Idaho State University. This is work that Andrew Blinn, who's a PhD student, he was at Idaho State, now he's at University of Georgia, still working up this kind of stuff. So he did a lot of the field work here. Me too, it was fun driving around. So let me orient you to Salt Lake. The punchline here is that here in-stream production is really driven by these highlight evaporative environments. And so water here is flowing north. This is the city. This is the city, the urban area kind of extends all of here. So this is Utah Lake, one of the most eutrophic, yucky lakes in the west. This is the Jordan River. So Utah Lake goes out of the Jordan River. There's a dam here. And all these pink lines are canals that were designed to take water across to feed irrigation for agricultural irrigation. So Jordan Canal is going up here. We have all these tributaries coming in from the side. This is where the skiing is. So lots of snow, beautiful, pristine mountain water coming in. And you'll see that these cross. And you'll see that there's some weird pinks coming out. So a lot of this water is actually drinking water that gets used for the cities. So it gets taken away. And then a little bit farther down, some water gets maybe dumped in. A little bit of paper water transfer. It's the west. So we're moving water around in these systems. It's a really complex system. And what we find is this is our indicator of in-stream production. And it's really high in canals. It's really high in the river, in the Jordan River. And it's super variable in these tributaries. So some of them are high, some of them are very low. This is probably that background level that we would expect to see. And what we're finding here, in-stream production is going to be, this is basically like a big hot soup pot. And a lot of I'll go back and show this. This is what a lot of the canals look like. This is the summer. So it's like really, really egregious in the summer. So there's a lot of primary production happening here, a lot of primary production happening in these canals. A lot of that water is getting dumped into the streams. And so we find that if we're looking at these tributaries, just looking at the number of canal crossings upstream is predictive of the in-stream of the autochthonous dissolved organic matter. There's a lot of uncertainty in this because we don't know how much water is getting actually dumped in any of these systems. And also we don't 100% know where all the canal crossings are, and where all the canals are. We get a much better relationship if we look at specific conductivity. And this is telling us, I think conductivity is a really good tracer of how much canal water is actually in that system, because those systems are just evaporating. So the canals have conductivity almost 3,000 microsiemens per centimeter in the summer, people who think about that kind of stuff. So what's going on in this system is we have, as we kind of move away from this textbook ecosystem, we see that dissolved organic matter is likely to be controlled by different features of the landscape. And in this system, it's really about how we're moving water around this landscape in these weird ways. So at the continental scale, we see that these gradients, these continental scale gradients, can shape not only the quality of organic matter across the continent, but also they can shape what local controls matter. So I'm just gonna very, very briefly talk about global gradients and how we might think about cities in a global context. So these are some data from the World Resource Institute that I resampled to cities. Just show this is a risk score from 0 to 5, where 5 is high risk for untreated connected wastewater. So that's we collect your wastewater, but then nothing happens to it, gets dumped into a stream, or unimproved sanitary infrastructure, which is good luck with your problem. So when we think about, when I talk to people who do urban work, I talk to lots of people, work with lots of people who do urban work within the United States. We always say, we want our work to have an impact. We work in cities for a reason, because of that question I said at the beginning, like, how do we design better cities? But just as work in Boston doesn't translate to Salt Lake City, that same problem, our work within the US doesn't necessarily translate when we think on a global scale. We have to think about other gradients. So most of the urban stream work in the world is happening here, yellow, here, yellow, here, yellow. So we need to think about different kinds of gradients and broader gradients when we think about how we can translate our work to a global context. I'm not doing that yet, but I would love to. And I think it's just a really important thing to say. So to wrap up, urbanization shapes watersheds and streams locally, all the way to globally, everything in between. We have to do local studies and also macro scale studies to be able to identify these kind of cross-scale interactions that control urban watershed functions. So I like to think of this as the like act local, think global kind of paradigm of urban watershed studies. And more importantly, I think this cross-scale understanding is really important because this will allow us to have more effective watershed management. So we can talk to watershed managers and say, hey, I think in your system, these are the things that are going to really matter. We can make predictions about what's going to matter where. And all of this is so important so we can hang out in urban streams and not have to worry about pooping. With that, I would like to thank so many collaborators on this work from my PhD work and also for the CURB project and the bazillion stakeholder partners that helped us get access to streams and talk to people who actually did work in those areas. With that, thank you so much, and I would love to take any questions.
So you've got trees and you've got wetlands, but what about forested wetlands? Like the majority of our non-tidal wetlands in Maryland are forested. How did you separate that out? Did you say we're going to look at non-wetland forests and then all other wetlands, or were there just marshes versus any forested system?
Great question. So we use the National Land Cover data set, and they categorize deciduous, evergreen, mixed forests, and we added those together. And then they have emergent and woody wetlands, and we added those together. So your forested wetlands would probably be counted in the woody wetlands, which in Boston it was woody wetlands specifically that really mattered in Boston. But for a lot of these analysis, there's so many variables. I mean, we pulled NLCD data, we got the tree canopy from the NLCD, impervious from the NLCD. We pulled so much census data that we hoped would matter. Some of it does. All sorts of data from EJ Screen. We got combined sewer overflow density from ECHO data set. I'm sure there's more things. A lot of data from the National Hydrography data set. Like we pulled so much data, and so it was like we had to narrow a little bit so that we weren't going on a full fishing expedition.
Really good. I enjoyed your talk a lot.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'm curious about what kinds of methods you use to characterize the dissolved organic matter, like the terrestrial content or the toxins.
Yeah. So dissolved organic matter is really fun because it's photoreactive. So we basically shine light at it and we see how much light goes through. And then we also see how much light gets re-emitted. So we look at fluorescence and absorbance. We measure what are called excitation emissions matrices, so EEMs. So at every 2 to 3 wavelengths, we shine light at it, and then we measure how much gets re-emitted at that. And that gives us like a really pretty picture that tells us about kind of the way that the DOM behaves in light is related to the structure of the DOM. And so people have done a lot of work, not me, in the past to figure out what all of those things mean by doing lots of careful things, by like taking organic matter that has been isolated and saying, what does it look like? So we can use that to say, oh, this is more protein-like organic matter, which is more likely to be fresh organic matter in stream production. And this is what happens when it gets humified. Yeah. Yeah. What was going on with Miami? So you grew up learning about watersheds, right? And you learn about Hubbard Brook, and it's like, oh, it's so great, it's so simple, you know, the water falls and it goes downhill, and under the ground, the water's also going downhill. And then you go to a city or a place like Miami, and it turns out that watersheds aren't real. So Miami is a wetland, and we really tried to delineate watersheds there, and it just doesn't represent reality. It's not a system that works for watersheds, which is really hard, because then it's hard to put I was like, I just want to put all the cities on the same x-axis. It was like, it's just not, we tried. So what we ended up doing in Miami was actually doing a buffer around each of the sampling points. So the other ones have contributing areas that we characterized. In Miami, it's a buffer around it, which I think does create some of those maybe weird relationships, but that, I don't know a better way to do it. It's like a groundwater system. So this is all surface water. In Miami, the canals are draining groundwater. So it's hydrologically very different than the other systems we were looking at. But we're working on a paper on how it's hard to do urban watershed stuff in different places. But it does really make it complicated for kind of comparing some of these relationships. Big caveat, extra salt.
Would you consider buffers, would that be like things like elevation, or what were you like considering as like?
So we were literally drawing circles around.
Oh,
Yeah, so like going in GIS, and here's the point, here's the buffer. Yep, so just a circle around the point.
It kind of brings up like a related question about the 5 cities, the geology, the mineralogy, all that is very different in those 5 cities as well. So
Yeah.
when you look at those factors, I mean, like Miami is all this kind of very just cars to fire.
That's a good question. We haven't looked into that too much yet. It has led to some issues with some of our other analyses. So one of the things we're working on, we're measuring extracellular enzyme activities on these. So that tells us a little bit about what microbes are devoting energy to scavenging from the ecosystem. So we can look at whether they're kind of looking for more labile carbon or more complex carbon, whether they're scavenging for nitrogen and phosphorus. And some of those assays are very pH sensitive. So we had, that was one of the, I was just like, this project is breaking my brain. It's one of the really big challenges in doing some of these cross-site projects, is that methods that would work really well in one place don't work really well in another place. It's really hard to kind of make everything comparable. We ended up using just ambient pH for all of the assays, which meant that for like 3 of the cities, for one of the assays, the answer was 0. But if we had like neutralized them, then it would have been different. So yeah, but we haven't looked at that as like a predictor for the DOM, but we can. Yeah.
Would you consider looking at other cities that are low-lying areas and wetlands for points of comparison for Miami in the future, to see if we can characterize that city a little bit differently, I guess, on its own?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'm not leading the work in Miami, so probably not something I'm going to do. But I do think that I think that there might be just something to be said, for thinking about kind of categories of cities that need to be treated in different ways. I don't know the best way to do that. Miami's like really stumped me. It broke my brain. But it's really interesting. So yeah, so they're using kind of some different ways of analyzing their data. Yeah. It's the best, I think, outcome for doing projects like this, is to have your brain broken a little bit and have to rethink all of your kind of paradigms.
I think watersheds within any wetland is difficult, because it's, where's the water flowing?
Mm-hmm.
So I can see that it's very flat like that. What about some of these international, you showed like the 3 areas where all the cities are. What about these other areas where they don't have the really connected agriculture and a lot of untreated waste and things like that? What would you think is happening in those areas, even in cities where that's happening? I'm just speculating at this point, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think in those places, I honestly think that wastewater is like the global gradient that matters. because that's going to end up being just a major source of organic matter. And there are such strong gradients in how it's managed or not. And, you know, and it has huge health implications, right? I mean, it has health implications here, and here we do a pretty decent job, even though we're doing a terrible job. But on like, you know what I mean, right? Like, on the grand scheme of things, we're doing better than some other places. But I really think that wastewater is like the global gradient that matters for thinking about stuff like this.
The infrastructure, the pipes versus the canals versus the natural channels, that does anything under those really high nutrient load concentrations. I mean, with that particular more natural system, would ameliorate things more, piping things through really quickly. I mean, sort of your earlier work in your PhD.
The thing is, like, so the challenging thing when you move globally is that there might not be the same centralized infrastructure, but there's lots of decentralized infrastructure. So like people are still moving things around in all sorts of ways. So you look at like flood management and informal settlements, like people are building things because they're trying to manage their own land. They're like, well, there's no city here. I'm not paying any taxes. And like, you know, I'm in charge of getting my own drinking water. I'm in charge of making sure that my own house doesn't flood. Like there's a lot of informal structures that are going on in these places. So I think there is a lot of infrastructure, but it's getting moved around in different ways, and
Jury-rigged infrastructure.
it's, yeah, very unpredictable, I think.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna head over to Luna.